On behalf of the Writers Institute of Georgia Perimeter College, I would like to thank all the faculty, staff, and students for coming out this afternoon to hear Judson Mitcham read from his works. Today we are here to begin the spring Visiting Writer in Residence program with one of our own. Judson Mitcham was born in Monroe, Georgia, where he grew up and where much of his writing is centered. He studied psychology at the University of Georgia, where he earned his undergraduate and graduate degrees. He received his Ph.D. in 1974 and is now retired from Fort Valley State University, where he taught psychology for many years. He has also served as adjunct professor of creative writing at the University of Georgia and at Emory University, where he has directed the Summer Writers Institute and currently teaches fiction. His poetry has been widely published, appearing in such journals as Harper's, Georgia Review, our own Chattahoochee Review, Gettysburg Review, Southern Poetry Review, and the Southern Review. His poetry collection, Somewhere in Ecclesiastes, earned him both the Devens Award and recognition as Georgia Author of the Year in 1991. His second poetry collection, This April Day, was published in 2002. His novel, The Sweet Everlasting, won the Townsend Prize for fiction and a second Georgia Author of the Year award in 1996. Mitcham's second novel, Sabbath Creek, 2004, also won the Townsend Prize. He is the first author to win this award twice. Now, one does not win the Townsend Award twice without knowing something about writing fiction. This biennial award is given to the top fiction writer in the state by Georgia Perimeter College, and has in the past found writers like Terry Kay, Ha Jin, Alice Walker, Mary Hood, and Farrell Sams on the winning end of the award. But no one has won it twice until Judson Mitcham did this with his second novel, Sabbath Creek. We are excited that he is here at GPC for the next 4 days to share his work and his love for the written word. Judson says this about writing: "The craft can certainly be taught. In my classes, I ask students to identify works that move them and to read them again, attending to the choices the writer has made. I encourage students to write with the understanding that they are producing drafts, not finished versions." Of his own work, he says, "I hope to produce fiction that shares the characteristics of good poetry: freshness and economy of language, mystery within clarity, a sense of rightness, of necessity." There's little argument that Judson Mitcham has done this with his work. The language of his prose is poetry to the ear. It is truly a pleasure to welcome him here today to share his writing with us. Would you please join me in a warm welcome for Judson Mitcham?
Well, thank you, Jack, for that very generous introduction. And I should say, tell you what you already know, that you're very fortunate to have a person with the talent of Jack Riggs as your colleague here and teaching here. His very fine novel, When the Finch Rises, is something that if you haven't read it, and I'm sure many of you have, you should read it. It always surprises me how many students will be in a class with somebody and not have read the work. I can't see why that would happen. So don't be one of those, because it'll open your eyes if you do read it. I am primarily going to read some poems here. I can hear a collective sigh of something from the audience. Poems to me are at the heart of any writing. It's not to say that all writers need to write poems, but it began for me with poetry. It seems that the necessity of getting something right in language, which is what Howard Nemerov says a poem intends to do, to get something right in language, it's the same thing that we're always trying to do in our fiction. I find that when I'm writing fiction, I can't write poems. And when I'm writing poems, I can't write fiction. So if they're so similar, why shouldn't they cross-pollinate and occur simultaneously? Well, probably because I have to go to sleep thinking about it and wake up thinking about it, whatever it is. And if it's a novel, it's like living another life. So that if the life that you're imagining doesn't include the writing of poems, then you're not going to be writing poems. I am going to read some new poems. I have a collection of poems coming out in September from the University of Georgia Press, which will be essentially a selected poems. It will be basically 3 books in one. Not all the poems in my first 2 books will be included, and it would just be my 3rd book of poems, so it would be a prematurely selected, is what one would have to call it. It's called A Little Salvation, Poems Old and New. And the new section is a section called Oblique Lexicon, and it's a lexicon. It's an alphabet, essentially, and they're poems from every letter. But I tried to write these poems without forcing them into categories. I wrote the poems, and then I just tried to find out where it went, and wrote enough of them that I ended up filling up the alphabet and having usually more than one poem for the entry. Now, I'm not quite sure sometimes what a poem is supposed to do when I've started it, when I'm going with it. It seems to me that a poem, as I said, should get something right in language. But it has to do something else as well. I don't believe a poem should be a little puzzle that you have to figure out. I don't believe a poem should be something that says, I'm smarter than you, see if you can figure out what it is I'm trying to say. I think it should be pretty clear what it is the poet is trying to say. I want to read you one that has no mystery at all about it. And it does what I think quite often a poem needs to do, which is to take the writer, the poet, down a couple of notches, which I don't find hard to do. I'm one of those irritating people. You've seen them. I'm not dangerous on the highway. I'm not like a person trying to dial a cell phone. Those are dangerous people. Drinking a beer, dialing a cell phone is tricky. I'm the sort of person that you look at and think, that person must be crazy. Because I find myself, because I drive alone almost all the time, that when I put the music on, I tend to move to it. You've seen these idiots going down the road, doing this, and if it's a person my age, it's just pitiful. So, one day in Macon on Northside Drive, I'm trying to make a left turn. Two left turn lanes. And I have Bob Marley on. I have him turned up loud. The song is Exodus. It's deep into the song. If you can listen to Exodus and not move, there's something wrong with you. But you still don't want to be a fool. So there I am. It's going Exodus, Exodus, and I'm doing this little thing. But I thought I was alone. And I looked to my right, and there's another car. and it's a carload of college students. And if you've ever seen people experience pure delight, you would have recognized it in these individuals. This was the funniest thing they had ever seen. And I, of course, was mortified. But I'm not going to quit. It's too late to stop. This poem, though, grew out of that experience, and which ought to tell you something about the way fine art works. Because, something embarrassing like that happens to you, you go home and think about it. How am I ever going to live that down? Well, I sprang into action and wrote a poem. But it's really not necessarily about that. The poem that I've written, the category that this poem is under is called Dead. The poem is Dead. The title is Dead. There's a couple of parts in it, but I'll just read you the first part. You're dancing in your car, caught slipping into the deep bass of Exodus, the spirit voice of Bob Marley, letting your shoulders go with it. You would laugh, too, if you saw yourself, and if you were someone else, because there is a blindness in us all, and here it is. You are ridiculous. To the folks suddenly beside you in their car and who can't hear the song, it says, open your eyes. It says, are you satisfied with the life you're living? If you can't dance alone in your car to Bob Marley, you may be dead already. Now, another thing about how poetry works, for me, and I think essentially how it works. The lines here, there is a blindness in us all, and here it is. Those are taken almost directly out of William James, the greatest psychologist ever, William James, who writes an essay on a certain blindness in human beings, which is to say we can't see into other people's lives. Other people's lives are forbidden to us. We can only see our own lives and value those lives above most others. But the poem wouldn't work if you put William James in it. You've got to think William James and keep him out. Don't quote him. Because if I start quoting William James to you, at least in most, there are some quotes, but if I start quoting William James and other people too often, then I'm showing off. Then I am attempting to impress you with what I know, instead of trying to find words for what I've experienced. But that theme of the blindness in us all is something that is one theme that has always stayed with me. I feel it when I first felt it when I was a child and I went to the Georgia football game. Monroe. I grew up in Monroe, we called it. And we would go to see the Georgia Bulldogs before they had the big stadium that Herschel built. And there was still 30,000, 40,000 people there. And I remember being 7 years old, looking at 30,000 people and thinking, who are these people? And why do they think they're so important? And why are they drunk? Which was really one thing I did wonder. What is that smell? Why do they think their lives are as important as mine? And how could they be? And how could it be that all these people will go home and I will never see most of them again, that their lives will go on? I was engulfed by that feeling when it first happened to me. It was a feeling of disappearing, essentially. And that seems a crucial human touchstone for me to getting into something larger. I still feel it when I go to the Atlanta airport. I always feel it at the airport. all these people who are going somewhere else, whom I will never see again. So this poem essentially plays off of that. And this is a true story. Not that it matters whether or not the poem is true, but this happens to be true. I got on a plane next to a woman who, well, she didn't really know whether I was a Christian, but she was determined to make me one before the plane landed. And as it turns out, I do know the tradition. Let's say it that way. I knew the story. But she insisted on telling it to me. This is called The Multitude. The woman in the airplane wanted to talk about God. I did not. I raised my magazine. She continued saying, Christ promised heaven to the thief who believed while nailed to the cross. The clouds looked solid far beneath. She began the story of her life, and I stopped her as politely as I could, saying, please, right now, I'd simply like to read. And for a while, she did keep quiet. Then she asked if I'd ever really given Christ a chance. So I tried telling her a joke. Chose the one about the Pope and Richard Nixon in a rowboat. She discovered nothing funny in the story. Jesus fed the multitude, she said. I looked around to find an empty seat. There wasn't one. She asked me if I knew about the sower and the seed, about Zacchaeus, Legion and the swine, Mary Magdalene, Lazarus, the rich young ruler, and I did. I knew about them all. I told her, yes, sweet Jesus. Got the stewardess to bring another bourbon. Tried to buy the missionary one, but she declined. And when the plane set down, I'd escaped up the aisle, made the door, and started walking fast toward the baggage claim. When I saw them all at once on the concourse, thousands I would never see again, who'd remain nothing in my life, who would never have names. And I realized I'd entertained, strangely, and for no good reason I could see, the hope of someone waiting there who loved me. You know, you write, certain things emerge in your writing. I have automobiles all through my writing. I don't intend to put cars in it, but cars keep showing up. Airplanes keep showing up. Kudzu keeps showing up. I guess that's understandable because you can't keep it out. Dirt roads, baseball. In other words, the life that I know, and the Baptist church. It's there. There's no reason to fight it, at least in the poems. There are traditions that we have to embrace, but not all traditions seem to me necessary to embrace. And there are certain things that are so troubling and so strange that they seem to ask for a poem to be written about them. If you're writing poems, or you're writing fiction, days come around, New Year comes around, Christmas comes around, springtime comes around, Halloween comes around. So for Halloween, what we do is we decorate our places of business and homes and other places with skeletons, tombstones, ghosts, and it's all in good fun. I know some people think it's satanic. Maybe it is, but it's all in good fun. Happy ghosts, nice little tombstone you got there. Skeletons, but here's the thing, and I know this has some unintentional humor with it, or maybe it's intentional. I apologize. My mother's been in a nursing home for 14 years now. First day of October, What she has on the wall of her room is tombstones, skeletons, ghosts. Now, why do you have to decorate the damn nursing home with tombstones? But it's always there. And I had seen this for many years, and I thought at some point I did what I had to do, is I sprang into action again and wrote a poem that had to do with the way I feel when I go into my mother's room and see the skeleton on her wall, which she doesn't even recognize anymore and doesn't, I think, is not aware of, but I am. And what happened, the thing that broke it for me was when I went to feed her. I was feeding her lunch once in the dining hall, and you're sitting in there, and all the people were sitting there, and my mother can't feed herself anymore, and so I was doing that for her. And above us in the nursing home with the dining hall fans, the people who decorated had made little ghosts, one for each blade of the dining hall fans, and going over our heads were ghosts. And it was on every fan. It was a big dining room, and so ghosts, 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 death, 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 death. And I thought, that's enough. So here's my poem having to do with that. It's called Halloween at the Nursing Home. Every year, first day of October, there they are. The sudden undead in the hallways. The cartoon tombstones, too many skeletons ready to dance. And all those crones on brooms whose eyes gleam and threaten as though they had flown in only to discover they can never leave. In time, Thanksgiving will come. But all October, the little ghosts, one for each blade of the dining hall fans, spin above the tables. They whirl, they celebrate like hand puppets set free of the body. Their skirts flaring out on the long carnival ride of the afterlife. As if giddy with forever, they sweep above the uncovered heads of the women who do not look up. I guess I don't need to explain why I said women, because it's all women. There are a few men occasionally, but we go out pretty soon. You know, it's the women. One thing that relates to this, when I I've forgotten the category I had it under. I'm sorry, I'll think of it in a minute. Well, I'll go into something else. It'll come back to me. One of the things that I like to do is to set myself a goal to do something that doesn't seem possible, and to see if I can do it in writing. And most often I can't. Emerson said that there's nothing that strong light cannot make beautiful. Is that right? There's nothing that strong light cannot make beautiful. Well, Emerson was, you know, he had a bit more optimism than many of us. There's a wonderful poem by Christopher Smart, Jubilate Agno, Praise or Rejoice in the Lamb, written by Christopher Smart, I forget what year it was, when he was in a madhouse. He was raving mad the entire time that he wrote this poem, but he was a religious ecstatic. I set out to write a poem in imitation of Christopher Smart. You probably know the poem, "For I Will Consider My Cat Jeffrey." And he writes about what the cat does, and he will look at the cat, for he is a servant of the living God, duly and daily serving him. For he can turn, for he can, and it's a celebration of the cat. I thought, well, what would be one of the most loathsome things you could try to celebrate? Let me try to find something completely loathsome, completely awful to celebrate. So I came up with one. The guinea worm. You know the guinea worm, Jimmy Carter's guinea worm, that he has so wonderfully tried to eliminate. The guinea worm, and here's a description of the guinea worm if you don't know what it is. Inside the human body, the larvae mature and grow as long as 3 feet. After 1 year, the thread-like worm emerges slowly through a painful blister in the skin. It is pulled out a few centimeters each day and wrapped around a small stick, a process that can take months. What a wonderful creature. For I will consider the guinea worm, for he is nowhere, a spirit in the water. For he slips in, a mystery, a cool drink, an echo of thanks. For he is silent forever, even broken in half, even snapped off as he is drawn out. For he is slow to make himself known. For he is the servant of the living God, duly and daily serving him. For he shakes and trembles with laughter, but he never laughs. For he opens the throat wide to old prayer, raw sound without a name. For he breaks out hot, a needle from the fire, blister water from the pond. For he is never mistaken, but he is not vain. He is a sliver of praise. For he gathers himself in many arms. For he humbles the young and the old easily. He sends them home. For the nations come after him. For he flashes and squirms something else through the dreams of his absence. For he waits there underneath the gold sun floating on the pond. For he forms his one nest under the skin, curled in on his whiteness. For he is good to eat breaded and fried, a fatty treat for the mad. For he holds on, and he holds on as if he cannot forget. For he is good to think on, if a man would express himself neatly. For he is simple, the number one, but hard to count. For he measures each eye that will watch his coming out, each eye that will not. For he goes in innocent, he knows no deceit, and he will hold nothing back. For he is one thing first, unseen in the water, and then he is another. For he is crushed underfoot. For he comes unaware unto his one shape, unable to stop. Now, don't ask me what possessed me to go off into that spasm of praise for a loathsome worm, but that has something to do with, for me, what makes both poetry and fiction. Most of the writing that I do fails. I say this directly to the students there. If you want to write, you're going to have to toughen up and fail. Because if you don't, you will never succeed. That has to be understood deeply. That most of what you write is failure on the way to success. And if you can't take failure, you can't get success. For these books, for both of these novels, I threw away hundreds of pages. I didn't throw them away. They're still in the computer. They're still in stacks, but they're just not there. They're not in here. They were necessary to find this work. I have stacks and stacks and stacks of poems at home. I have stacks and stacks and stacks of poems in manila folders that didn't go anywhere, that did not work for me. But some days it does work. And generally when it does work, it works in a very modest way. Here's an example of a poem that is a very modest poem. One advantage of writing a sequence like this, like the lexicon that I'm writing, is that you can have large poems, like the one I just read, Jubilate, to fill one category, and then you can have modest ones, like the one I'm about to read, that is really small, because it's supported by the other poems. A year and a half ago, my daughter got married. She's 27 now, and she lives in Chicago. She's a comedic actress, and all of which has nothing to do with it, but I just like to brag on her, so there she is. And I tried to write a toast for her wedding rehearsal. I tried to write it as a poem. I couldn't do it. I tried and I tried and I tried, and I couldn't do it. So I just wrote out a toast as an ordinary prose piece, as good as I can make it. And just as well as it wasn't a poem, I cried my way through it. I could barely read it. But I kept wanting to write this toast and never could. And one reason I couldn't write it was that I've been trying to write a wedding toast for many years that wasn't serious. Because I've always been fascinated by those people who get married on the Ferris wheel, the golf course, Sanford Stadium, people who are married wearing red and black. That fascinates me. You've got your NASCAR wedding. I'm not putting it down. I'm celebrating it. But it's still fascinating to me. And I have collected examples of these. But this is just like an 8-9-line poem about that, which celebrates these odd weddings. It's called Toast. Here's to the freestyle plighting of the troth, nuptials in free fall, weddings in the aisle at the ball game. Let us raise a glass to anyone who does take another, for better or worse, but underwater. Or perhaps atop a Ferris wheel or fire tower, or floating on the lake. Let us drink to those who will always have Elvis and Memphis and that figure on the cake. 3 of them on the cake. You ever seen those cakes? I have so many obsessions, I have to cut them out of my poems. I have too many cows in poems. When I first started writing poems, there were so many cows, and people started sending me pictures of cows. That was embarrassing. And I began to think it was, after all, just a stock image. Sometimes, and that's the worst pun you ever heard, I know. Sometimes people will write poems and they will say, and they will be bad. Students will write poems or fiction and they will say, but this really happened. But I didn't make it any good. Just because it really happened. There are things, and everybody knows this, that you can't put in your fiction because there's too much symmetry to it. It's too odd. You can't use it. It's just too right. You have to step back and say, well, you have to say within the work that it happened. I had an aunt, my Aunt Reba, who had a phobia, a weather phobia. For the last, it must have been 60 years of her life, she was afraid of rain. And after her husband died, if it didn't have to rain, it just had to look cloudy, she would head to your house, to my house, to my parents' house, to a niece or a nephew's house. and stay there with them because it was a cloud coming up. Well, now, you had to know my Aunt Reba to know why you didn't want her coming to your house, because she knew how you were supposed to do everything, and she would tell you in no uncertain terms how you were supposed to do it. So she became a nuisance. And we all tried to figure out how to keep Reba at home. Mean sort of thing to feel. So she died. At her graveside, while we sat under the canopy, out of a sky that wasn't clear, but wasn't that cloudy, rain came down on us like it was like a biblical rain, an amazing rainfall as the preacher began to talk at the graveside. And you know how it is under the little canopy there, and you got chairs, and on the first row of relatives, on us, those closest to her, both literally and emotionally, the canopy opened up and dumped its rain on top of us. Now that's true. So I've just told you the whole poem. So, but it's important that you understand that this is true. Somehow the truth matters here. The symmetry of the universe. Just graveside. The sky did threaten. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not. At that word, rain hit hard, quick as a fall on a slick floor. The preacher had to shout. That this is all true does matter. Aunt Reba had a crazy fear of rain all her life. After Vasco died, if she saw a cloud that worried her, she would head out to a niece's house or a nephew's. And after years of this, the rain made us uneasy too. But true to God, with the words, "My cup runneth over," the canopy opened and dumped the rain, weighing it down, buckets of it, that fast. It was a biblical rain, onto the first row, onto those of us closest to her. When we walked around, when that happened, I just walked around like, what? How? How can the world be that way? I have another little story about this sort of thing happening that I sort of want to tell in my master class on Friday, but in a more formal way. But I'll tell it to you now. A similar sort of thing that happens. I had just had my first novel published, and I was full of myself, and I was walking around one day, and I had just gone out for a run, and I was walking back home, and it was a beautiful day. It was a terrific day. It was a sunny day. It was a fall day. It was great. I felt good. I was healthy. I stopped and did what I almost never do. I just stopped. And I said to myself, life is good. You know? I mean, how cheesy is that? But I actually did that. I came to a stop. And a bird shat on my head. Right then. Okay, that's that story. But you see what I'm talking about. That's the way life is. It's, okay, now put that in a book. Well, why don't you have the bird shit on his head over here in the scene? Well, you can't do that because, I mean, is that going to happen? No. But it happened to me, and it happened to me right at that moment. And it made me feel like something else is going on in the universe. You know, pride goeth before a fall of some kind. Got a time for maybe a couple more, is that? For many years, I tried to write a villanelle for my friend Larry Brown. the late, great Larry Brown, fiction writer, former fire chief of Oxford, Mississippi, self-taught. And I know Larry has been here. I know he was here back in the 90s. Author of Big Bad Love and Joe and Father and Son and Dirty Work. And there was an article about Larry just yesterday in the New York Times about a retrospective that they've had for him in Oxford, Mississippi, a tribute concert that they held. But Larry was a great, great person, great writer, country boy. I tried to write a villanelle, which is a very tight form. You know it if you know Dylan Thomas's poem, "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night," is the most famous villanelle that there is. I tried to write it using 2 lines from one of Larry's short stories. Never could get it. So after Larry died, and these years later now, I wrote this little bitty thing. I was trying to write a funny poem, but it didn't work. Villanelle. Brother, I'm trying here for a poem that's got some humor in it. I know you're dead, son, but help me out. All those years I tried to write my big bad villanelle using those lines out of Samaritans from your first book. But that didn't work out either, did it? Shit, Larry, I'm dying here. Woman in the bar slams down her beer can. I done changed my mind, she says. I'm going to stay here with you. I love you. That's that woman in Samaritans. I'll end with with another odd poem about the oddity of the real world, with strange things that happen. And I've never read this poem in public. I don't really know how it comes across. I don't even really know how it comes across on the page. It did really happen to me. And I feel like I have to preface it by telling you sort of the punchline to it, so you'll understand that this is true. For some reason that matters to me. I go to the gym every day and pretend to work out, ride the bike for 3 or 4 minutes and lift a weight, and shower, and go home and eat. And it was a couple of years ago. I was in Macon, where I live. I was in the gym there, and it was just me and a couple of other guys there, and nobody else was in the locker rooms, and they were on the other side of lockers from me. And I heard them talking. I didn't know these people. I didn't remember seeing them when I came through. I didn't know who they were, and they were talking. They were 2 men talking about the death of the son of one of them. And it was really heartbreaking. And I will relate the dialogue here. But when we get to I sat down because the sort of unsavory aspect of being a writer is that you want to eavesdrop on people. You want to hear about their troubles. You want to overhear them when they don't know you're listening to them, and you want to write it down, which keeps me lurking around in grocery stores and so forth. I mean, I like to do that. But so these guys started talking, and they were talking about this tragic thing, about this grown son of this man who had died. I was ready to go, but I sat back down to listen. Just sat there and listened to them talking on the other side of the lockers. And then the man says, they come around to talking about the man who has lost his son. He says, he went out to his house the other day, and I saw his old truck. And I saw his old truck. And when I saw his old truck, it just broke me down. I just stood there and cried. I just stood there and cried and cried. And then there's silence, and the other man, finally, his friend says, "Just broke down, huh?" And the man who's lost his son says, "No, it cranked right up." I can't tell you what effect that had on me. I don't know why it had such a strong effect on me who have overheard this awful misunderstanding that was at one time funny, but not funny at all. So I'll end with this poem called Wrong. I'm changing clothes at the gym, headed home, when I overhear two men talking beyond the next row of lockers. We're both doing all right, I guess. The three of us are alone in the locker room, late evening, the other voice halting and awkward. Not something you just get over. I know that, if you ever do. A metal door whines and bangs shut. No, it's not. Not when it's your own child. I'm tying my shoes. You ought to go before they do. I'm dressed now. He had a little boy himself, 3 years old. He's a pistol. I hear a chuckle. I hear the ache inside it. I stand and I feel for my keys. How's his wife doing? A man runs in, curses at the clock, rushes out. I sit back down. What's wrong with a man like me who will do this? Sit back down so he can listen. Better than I am, I guess. Went out to his house the other day. The voice sticks in his throat. And there was his old truck. I stood there and cried. The quiet hardens. The other man, the good friend, waits. And finally, he says, just broke down, huh? And the bereaved father, no, it cranked right up. I'm on my feet now, hustling out the door. I'm fighting my way home through the heavy air. Thank you. I was a physiological psychologist. I studied brain function. I couldn't say that really any other psychologist influenced my writing much, unless you would count Søren Kierkegaard as a psychologist. The philosopher Kierkegaard, who has been called a psychologist, seems to me really at the heart of the view of life that I would like to hold. Maybe not as Christian a view of life as he would have. The other influence that psychology had on me, I guess I would have to say my teachers at the University of Georgia, who taught me, you might not think this, but in the writing of papers in psychology, to use no extra word. It doesn't sound that way because when you read psychology papers, you think, well, they're full of jargon, but they're really not. They really don't lack economy. The jargon may be there, but you can't use a metaphor in psychology if you don't have the right metaphor. You can't play around with it. So the editors that I had there, my great friend Roger Thomas, who was my major professor at the University of Georgia, I would point to. And I hesitate to say this, but the historians of psychology, the most famous historian of psychology ever, the man most appropriately named E.G. Boring, was a great teacher. So people from books, but William James is intriguing. I mean, what a great family he came from. Henry James was his brother. Alice James was his sister. And his books are novelistic in a way. I guess what I want to say, to make a short story long here, is that the greatest influence my involvement in psychology had on me was where I was teaching it. Now, I was teaching psychology for 30 years at Fort Valley State University, historically black college, the only historically black college, state college in Georgia that's in a small town. In my experience of growing up in the segregated South and going to Fort Valley State in 1974 and not working just with black people, but for black people, and being the essentially an emotional and intellectual guardian of the children of black people. After I was about 20 years there, taught me something. It took about 20 years for something to open up inside me where I realized something. And that's in these books that I didn't read from today. That's in these novels. Both these novels deal with the experience of black and white in the South in as clear a way and as deep a way as I can do it. That was my main, the psychology of, being white, I think, is what came to me. Anyone else dare ask another question? Well, I write them and write them and write them over and over again on legal pads. And I start them again, I start them again, I start them again, I start them again. I save all the drafts. I never type them up until I think I've got them done. And I think it's just, writing, making them as long as I can make them, and then I like to use the method of revision that the late Donald Justice used to talk about, the great teacher of poetry at the University of Iowa. I like his method of revision. He says the best way to revise is to cut out the bad parts. And that's it. If I reread a poem of mine and I have any hesitation about any of the lines, I put a mark by it and try to make it right, or else cut it out. Murder your darlings is, I don't know who said it, but somebody said that's what you have to be willing to do. You have to be willing to cut the best part if it doesn't fit with the overall whole. So the development of some real honesty about your own work, because it's not really about what other people think about it. If you don't like your own work, why keep it? I mean, so you're going to be a published poet or fiction writer. That's going to mean something. But the value of it that you look back on, I learned this very early when I published poems before they were ready. When I was young, well, I wasn't that young, but I published them before they were ready, and now I have to look at them and don't really want to see them. I do think there's a real, such a thing as a real poem. And I think that there's such a thing as a real novel and a real short story. But it's easier to see in terms of the poem. I go back to what Howard Nemerov said, to quote him again, about poems. He said, he wrote an essay called The Likeness of Poems to Jokes. Everybody understands what a real joke is. You could tell a joke that's not funny, and everybody will tell you, well, that's not funny. That's not a joke. What's wrong with you? You can't tell a joke. Some of you can't tell a joke. I can't tell a joke. I can hear a joke. I remember the punchline, but I can't tell it. The joke inheres in the form of the telling, not in a summary or the punchline. Well, the poem inheres in the telling, not in the summary or the punchline. The novel inheres in the telling, not in the summary or the punchline. So I think what you do is you keep with your work until it's as real as a joke, until it works as well as a joke. And there is some release at the end of it, which is a release like not the same modality of a joke, but it's real. It's something real. But that's the best I can do. I don't have any answer beyond just try to be honest, try to have a clear eye, try to keep working. Don't show anything to anybody else unless they're a person who knows what a poem is or a story is or a novel is. Don't show it to your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your mother, your father, your wife, or husband, unless they read fiction and unless they read poetry, because they'll tell you what they think. Whether they know anything about it at all, they will tell you what they think. It's you and maybe one other person you have to please, one other good reader. Sometimes your teacher is your good reader. Okay? Thank you. It was a very great grunt. I tried to run the bill. I tried to fight for the form. Oh, if you tried to go and tell it was some people for going on to get them and not side. That's the most famous held in the area to try to ride. I use it to and ride from the land of Sarah to much one. So, left to well, these first year later, I really this used to be clear. I was trying to find out if one did work. Well, I'm sure I like to hear horror and point. Try to hear something here. I know I made your son. We're down at midnight. Over here, I tried to my big bill. I tried to use an eyes lot of something. You from those people out of star. So I did not work today. Shit, there. Then I did the and I'm on ball slash stands beyond her hair. Keeping her and here's Jane. I'm up and she says, "Shut up, my God!" And I said, "Here with you." That's on that one. In some that one.